After preparing your readings for today, um, even though the Nick Land piece or the excerpt of it is pretty dense, um, I think the compact article that you're assigned probably did a good job of at least acquainting you enough with the concepts that we can start to unpack it a little. And my thought is that by unpacking it, what I mean is I'll ease us into some of the discussion of land um, by contextualizing it and make a couple of references to McLuhan that I think will set us up really well for when we meet again. When I'm going to expect us, to still engage on this point. So it'll just be a continuity of what we're working on. You're not going to have new material. First of all, if we're situating this part of the course, the way that I would put it and the way it looks in your syllabus is that I tried to give us some foundational texts for understanding American political thought in the more contemporary sense. And to do that, we have to spend some time with thinkers that are prior to our period because they're basically our tools. And that's why I call it foundations. So in addition to that, we also spend some time with some thinkers who aren't American. But again, the thinkers we spent time with are all extremely important to the American context. So all of that is to say, we're now in a part of the course where we are getting to dig more deeply into content because of what we've done before, and what we've prepared for thus far. And everything that we're doing at this point is going to have a clearly contemporary significance. Land is someone we need to understand from the perspective of understanding anything about American politics and influential philosophies in the American context, not just in the tech world, but as you see, I think, from our readings and from what we've done so far, the tech stuff is political, quite clearly. And you are actually on the cusp of a lot of these major questions as voters and as citizens. And so you need to understand what we're dealing with, what we're talking about, what we're facing. In terms of how rapidly society and politics are changing. And in the American context, there's a lot up for debate right now. Part of my thought is that we're studying departure points and reflection points that will help you engage in that kind of thinking as you think about the future. So, all of that is to say that as we're continuing, I'm just going to kind of check in with you in the course and tie it back to the things we've done so far. I think you saw that Tocqueville had significance for McLuhan and for McLuhan's message generally. And that actually turned out to be pretty important for him and important for understanding how he thinks about politics and networks of politics. Um, these are the kinds of things you kind of need to have in your mind as we go. So let's begin. We talked a little bit about Marx a few times in this course. Um, we talked about him when we studied McIntyre, um, and we talked about him when we were studying Tocqueville and Montesquieu. He came up probably indirectly when we were looking at Chomsky at the beginning of the term as well. And it might be useful now, just at least a little, to talk to you about Hegel and Marx and sort of the points they share about history. Marx is responding to Hegel, and Hegel, in a lot of ways, is responding to Kant. Kant is, his interest is in something called transcendental philosophy, which is a philosophy that begins with reflecting on the conditions of possibility for experience. And in that way, it's kind of prioritizing experience as the path to existence. This is an important metaphysical shift in the West. And it kind of sets off a chain reaction where we end up with Hegel. And Hegel is a lot more political than Marx. Hegel is a lot more political than Kant. Marx is extremely political. But that's in part because Hegel is so political. What you see happen with Hegel is kind of some challenges to Kant's metaphysics or reactions to that. But then looking at the implication of this new way of thinking for political science. And if you ever want to read a good interpreter of Hegel, I would recommend Charles Taylor. He has a smaller volume. Well, he has 2 volumes. One is really big and the other is smaller. He's a good interpreter. And for Hegel, history is almost like this force that is godly, comes to know itself through the workings of the world. So, for example, he has a theory of world historical individuals, like Caesar would be one. And these are like individuals who shift our timeline and bring important moments of progress and the carrying out of what he thinks is the goal of the end of history, which is a type of universal human right. We actually talked about him when we talked about Fukuyama. I don't know, we briefly talked about Fukuyama at one point in the class, who wrote The End of History. And so Geist works itself out through this historical process that to us seems to be unfolding in a sort of mysterious way. But for him is a process of something divine, which actually also is kind of like the source of what we are too, coming to know itself through these processes and work itself out to a particular conclusion, which for him is a particular configuration of the state. and of the role of family in the state and the art in the state, and he gets into a lot of detail. But the important thing to kind of see in this discussion, and of course I'm not able to do it justice, is this idea that there's a force that is unfolding through the events and actors of the world that is bigger than its parts, bigger than any one person. And it's working its way toward some end of history through political processes that, in a way, have the appearance then of being somewhat predetermined. Marx, it has critiques of Hegel in really important ways. But for our purposes of the story we're thinking about here, what he shares in common is this idea that there are material processes in the world that are some force working itself out toward an end. And for him, of course, it's much more economically coded. Hegel is really interested in freedom and liberty as products or goals of this process. And Marx is too, though of course that means something different for him. So the extent of what we need to know about those thinkers, and they each would deserve much more time, but for our purposes, I'm getting to them in a really narrow sense. We're looking at some sort of conception of the unity of the metaphysical and material, being driven or compelled by a force that has some transcendental significance, especially for Hegel, leading to a culmination that is fated, destined in a way, but has to be worked out through historical processes. Now, all of that being said, in American political theory and in our context, the ways that this theory really shows up in ways that are important for us are, well, for one, like we talked about Fukuyama's end of history, right? This idea that when there's a sort of general consensus on democracy and democratic peace theory seems to be confirming itself, human rights seem to be, if not universally possessed, universally recognized. This is some sort of fated telos of the goal, the thing that humanity has been working out unknowingly this whole time through like some guided process, unwittingly guided process. And Fukuyama, like we've touched on at different points, is very important because when we talked about it in class, one of the things we said was, in our political moment, there's so much that is up for debate. You wouldn't say that democracy has won the day. Universal human rights are widely acknowledged and unchallenged, that liberalism is uncontested. You wouldn't say that. When Fukuyama was writing, it made a lot of sense to say that. And it is a very quick turnaround to end up where we are. And I tried to convey how drastic that switch feels, having lived through it. To go from that level of optimism and certainty to being now in a situation where Fukuyama seems to be dreaming. We talked about that sense of it. Of course, American progressivism in the early 20th century especially Woodrow Wilson, it's going to have some relationship, especially to Hegel. But the reason that we're talking about it now in a more focused way, in a more specific way, is to talk about something called accelerationism. You may have picked it up. If you read philosophy on your own, you certainly almost for sure have at least come across the concepts. You probably, if you read the news, have picked it up. If you read about different characters, different political characters who have a connection to it. Obviously, there's some salience here for talking about Peter Thiel, who does kind of see himself as engaging in philosophy, whether or not we think he would be able to do that well. All of this milieu is very steeped in the tradition of accelerationism, so it's important to talk about it. And we're going to talk about it in connection to the tradition that I talked about already, which began with me introducing some salient concepts from Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And what the connection point is, again, we don't have enough time to do justice to deploying any sort of extent of any of those theorists to what we're doing. What you need to know kind of for our purposes is that accelerationism shares this idea that there is some fate that is driving human affairs that is more powerful, more knowing, and sort of with or without our consent, leading to a particular culmination of history. And that the philosopher and the political philosopher and the statesmen who are successful are the ones who can identify and respond to this drive or this wave. For accelerationism generally, there's this idea that capitalism has the seeds of its own destruction, which is just Marx, and sort of that there's a fragility in the system. The system is meant to end, but you have thinkers like Deleuze in particular who suggest that the way to understand this school of thought that they're inheriting is to see the role of the philosopher or the political actor as one of accelerating the process of decline. So even if it's the case that this experiment, neoliberalism, capitalism, whatever, is destined to fail, it has the seeds of its failure in it, that the mandate, so to speak, is to accelerate that failure. It's a type of atypical Marxism. And a lot of times, there's some sort of sense, and all of this is something Land shares, and this is part of my situating him for us. There's shared ideas from that departure point around certain things, like technology, for example, that automation is going to play a big role in this decline. That, we, in this advanced static decay, imagine that we have actually a lot of control over technology and its processes, its unfolding. For example, the development of AI or something like that. But it's illusory. We don't have control over that. It's fated that it will come to be. Such progress can't be controlled. And there's a sense for some of the earlier versions of these thinkers that this is better for humanity to accelerate the process, though that quickly falls by the wayside, especially for someone like Land, who's not interested in whether it's best for humanity. But early on, there's that sense, or at least the sense that it's not stoppable, so humanity's got to have some sort of... and that's my dog. So this type of thinker is going to really expect or desire then that government really ease any form of regulation. A very sparse state, a very deregulated state from the perspective of intervention, reduced government, and sort of carte blanche, freedom, funding for tech. So a lot of these folks like Prometheus, the idea of Prometheus, and in the earlier versions of this, the goal is always post-capital society. Now, what Land does with this is, I've talked to you before, and we've talked about this with McIntyre. Thought always exists in traditions, and thinkers are always responding to someone before, or lots of someone's before, to problems, questions that they've inherited. So he's inherited this, Land has, and so has a whole group with him, really. And he sort of says that goal, that post-capitalism goal, that is being worked toward or worked out in this irresistible way that we can cooperate with or not, is what does he call it? The techno-capital singularity. So it's more specific than the goal of post-capitalism. In fact, it's post-capitalist, but probably not in the way that we think about Marxian, language. How does he describe it? I want to be sure I get this exactly right. Basically that there's accelerated structural and technological forces in capitalism in this period of development that he's talking about, through an effort, a coordinated effort from the political world, political leaders, thinkers, economic, tech people, right? And of course, it's already been kind of presented as irresistible. So the force is itself, that there's this effort or fate, or you might say a cooperation of these secondary institutions and primary institutions I mentioned with a sort of fate, to cultivate new kinds of knowledge, new kinds of political discourse, so like discarding rights language, for example, discarding democracy, and new economic doctrines, all sort of with a emphasis or sort of material reality where you're maximizing the movement of production. It's like nonstop production, nonstop movement of that process, nonstop, what is he called? Cybernetics. So this is what he calls the techno-capital singularity. And again, it's I'm kind of only gesturing to it, and we can talk about it more in class, but that's kind of a starting point of where we're going. So we went through all those steps, these thinkers, their understanding of history and the processes of history, and now we've ended up in a place where we have land, and what he sees as not just the story or the mandate of acceleration to bring about the post-capitalist future, but a specific conception of what that looks like, which is the techno-capital singularity. Now, in some ways, this makes more sense if you think about all of this from the perspective of the challenges that society currently faces. So if we're having this conversation right now, and as we're talking about it, you're thinking about data centers in rural areas of the country, or you're thinking about policy, about automation, or government funding or regulation or deregulation of AI, all these very real things that we are literally living through. That is sort of the moment land is wanting us to step into and accelerate. Now, I could talk. He's so conversant with so many previous traditions, and he's using them in new and interesting ways, and we can talk about that at some point. But I think maybe the best thing at this time is to just read something from him. For land, there's this moment, and when I'm reading what he says, think about our moment. For land, there's this moment in neoliberalism that comes to a place where, quote, events increasingly just happen. They seem ever more out of control, even to a traumatic extent. Because the basic phenomena seems to be a break failure, so one thing about his language is when he's talking about philosophical concepts, he's going to put in a lot of concepts from more mechanical or technical understandings. Because the basic phenomena seems to be a break failure, accelerationism is picked up again. Accelerationism links the implosion of decision space, and here, this is me adding again. You remember McLuhan, we talked about how McLuhan says the medium is the message, and that the medium is basically the thing that organizes and structures power. Even the process of how humans deliberate and make decisions. And he gives the example of, and this is something Habermas shares, right, the fittingness of the relationship between the printed press and deliberative democracy, or at least representative democracy. Okay, so, he thinks there's a relationship between medium, tech, and tech, in other words, and human deliberation. So, going back. Accelerationism links the implosion of decision space to the explosion of the world, that is, to modernity. For accelerationism, the crucial lesson was this: a negative feedback circuit, such as a steam engine, governor, or thermostat, functions to keep some state of system in place. So, I don't like have scientific training, but a negative feedback loop, from what I understand, the little, the things I do understand, is a concept. He's getting it from computer science specifically, I think. Is a circuit or a mechanism that is basically meant to help a system stabilize itself. So specifically, a circuit or a mechanism in which the output of a system is used to regulate or suppress its own activity. So after reading that, and armed with our sort of insights from McLuhan, I think you can probably see why this is timely. Land also, and again, this is I'm not going to be able to give like an exhaustive treatment. It's what I'm saying is it has its limits. Though we'll pursue more. Another thing that Land picks up is this. So right, he takes this sort of strand from Deleuze and he reworks it. He also takes sort of these reflections on technology, and on sort of technology's emphasis or impact on the human world, the human itself. Tons of writing on this, tons of speculation. Some of the most important work, of course, is done by Heidegger. And one of the things, you see this in McLuhan, is this idea that technology is not neutral. Like, we think of it as a tool. But there's a way in which our tools shape us. And that's actually a fairly ancient idea. You can see Socrates articulate this idea. You can see Aristotle in a certain way articulate it too. So it's not new, right? But in a lot of ways, technology is new, and the dimensions in which it shapes us is new. So, instead of tech being this sort of neutral tool that becomes what we put it to use for, the idea is that it is shaping and molding us. And we talked a lot about that with McLuhan. So Land is going to extend the work of thinkers who have said, tech is not neutral. Well, what does tech want? There's a particular thinker, Kevin Kelly, I think, who did a good, starting with him is a good way to sort of get where Land's coming from on this. Tech is controlling the user, right? Who controls the tools. Again, this is not a new idea. But this means, it's taken to the extent that, cars, the technology of cars wants you. Like, it's a mechanical horse, and it wants you to build more roads so it can go more places. And it's like seeking its own proliferation, its own complexity, its own growth. It drives you and your desire to get that outcome for itself, right? That's sentience in some way. Kelly is attributing this to cars even, right? And he thinks all tech is like this. Um, and what Land does is he takes this even further, uh, in the context of the theory of accelerationism. Okay, so now what is it that is driving it? What is it that's working itself out to be known or to disclose or to come, um, extend itself fully? Well, it's something that is mediated or is working its consciousness through technology. And it's something that either is identical to what's driving technology or is being mediated through tech to proliferate and extend it. That's where Land is going to come from, right? You're going to take all this. And specifically, technology, particularly technology that has explicit intelligence, like artificial intelligence, though he also talks about financial technology and other things, right, that are related. But AI might be the most tangible example for us. That thing has the goal, AI has the goal of dominating the future, to become ubiquitous, to become suffused entirely in the material world and how it's constituted, and to, in that way, sort of upgrade and continue to extend and reproduce itself. And for Land, this is in a lot of ways a process where that drive is one that is going to render humans either irrelevant or extinct. So AI is leading us, and accelerationists are cooperating, in this reading, with the process of the AI leading us to our own extinction for its own ubiquity, dominance, and proliferation. This is what Land means when he talks about an invasion from the future. It's a very inhuman future. And he challenges space-time generally, which I think kind of makes sense given our discussion of McLuhan. But and technology and space and time. But I think kind of even more importantly, when he says this is an invasion from the future, and obviously, like I said, there's a challenge of how space and time work, to how space and time work and how we conceive of it. And the future, in a sense, is real now. But also, there's a sense in which there's an invasion for the future because there's this sort of irresistible pull, or this surrendering to that tech that we feel as humans. We feel drawn to it. And there are times where Land sounds like what the job of the philosopher is, in some ways, is to prevent humans from destroying that plan or that working out. Here he'll use terms like K-space, right, which is kind of cyberspace unbound, K-war, which is a war like in that unbounded space that accelerates this total collapse. And the task of the revolutionary, then, like when you think about the Marxist revolutionary who's supposed to bring the end of capitalism, what I've set out here is the task of the revolutionary. Land thinks this is the true task of the revolutionary. What all of this would really mean is to bring about the techno-capital singularity. So again, we'll talk about this more. But that's kind of my way of hopefully easing you into the work, making some of the connections with McLuhan, also showing you sort of the way that this research is like playing a role in our course and kind of where we're headed and what we're doing. So again, good job, and I look forward to seeing you soon.